So did I explain you first why I was doing this interview?
Here's the thing. The US thinks that it has a culture, but it really does not have a culture. When I say this, like, the US just has their culture, like baseball games and shit like that, but it's not a culture.
Do you think the US has a culture?
I do think the US has a culture.
Not really.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't think so.
Absolutely. No.
Yeah. What is the difference between bacteria and America? Bacteria, at least in 1,000 years, they can create a culture.
Obviously, not everyone practices the same traditions and customs, and not everyone has the exact same beliefs, but there's like a tendency.
It is an identity that we use to like define ourselves, and like you have regional cultures, but you also have a national culture that everyone kind of unifies behind. May not be great, but it is a culture.
I think they get it from other countries and kind of change it so they can adapt it for their own needs.
The United States spent so many years eradicating every other culture that was initially on our land and melting it all into these little subgroups. We've become so diverse and yet so muddled in our own expression of culture that we have denied every form of culture that has come into our country.
I think often we confuse the word culture and the word cultured. I associate being cultured with being like higher class, sophisticated, which can be more associated with like European style of doing things versus the American style of doing things, where we have larger servings and we have fattier foods, and like we're lacking in a little bit of sophistication and class. But that doesn't mean we don't have a culture. It just means we're not as cultured.
I mean, every culture has a culture. We just don't notice it because it is our culture. Everything you see Western culture, so you don't notice it being culture. But like if you go to the Western world, their culture is different, and they consider American culture entirely different from theirs.
A lot of times, anthropologists will say something like, the fish doesn't talk about the water. Anthropologists have had a hard time coming up with a definition that everybody agrees on.
I guess a nice, succinct definition would be patterns of behavior and knowledge that gets passed on from one generation to another.
It's a combination of assumptions, values, beliefs.
All of that information that we carry that we learn from being a part of a group that let us interact with other people in predictable ways.
It's definitely something that people can identify with, but the only problem is that the culture is not fixed. It's fluid, it's negotiated, it's contested, and it's always in motion.
One of the things that we really stress in anthropology is that we can't really think of entire cultures as being more advanced or less advanced, or better or worse, or more developed or less developed.
They're adaptive to different sets of conditions, and they're shared among different sized groups of people.
It contains a variety of elements, and some of those elements are contradictory. If I can reduce what I think is the most identifying characteristic of someone who's French, then I'm probably going to be stereotyping everyone in France. And then also, I'm just going to be oversimplifying it, because a culture is fluid and it's made up of multiple factors.
You can't measure culture. You can study culture. You can examine cultural artifacts like laws and spiritualities and music and art. You can examine them. You can trace where they come from.
But I think that culture itself is too holistic an idea to be able to say this one's more developed, that one's less developed. They're developed in different ways.
And it's in a constant state of discussion and development.
In Senegal, Senghor, talking about civilization, called it la civilisation de l'universel. That is a give and take. The cultures complete each other.
There are traditions in France, there are traditions in Britain. Some of those traditions have disappeared. America has traditions, and some of those traditions survive. So, I think it's inaccurate to say that tradition is stronger in outside of the United States, or that the United States doesn't have traditions.
It's referring to something more specific when it's used in a popular sense. It's typically, I think you can boil it down to the arts.
There is a history from definitely in the 18th and the 19th century. European visitors who came to the Americas would say that it wasn't very cultured. And what they meant by it, they were normally talking about high culture. They were saying that it doesn't have opera, and classical music and those kinds of things. So there is a tradition of European travelers coming over and saying that thing about the United States, but they were only talking about high culture.
Question for you as a European: if Americans don't have a culture, then why do Europeans keep playing our music? Rock and roll comes from African American rhythm and blues, and it switches from African American rhythm and blues. It gets played by white musicians, and the record industry gives it another name, rock and roll. And so the first musicians who play a music that most people would call rock and roll are all Americans. Elvis starters, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis.
Sometimes they might be thinking of the depth of history of a place. So, in Europe, those cities that people live in have been around for a long, long time. There's a very deep history to those cities. And you don't have that same depth of history to a lot of the towns and the cities in the United States. So in that sense, one could say that it's a more recent history that you have in the United States. The history is maybe shallower in the United States. But even a statement like that would make me feel a little uneasy as an anthropologist, because it would be ignoring Native American history.
Now, Native Americans were here much longer, and they certainly had strong cultural traditions before we clobbered them. But because they're not usually the ones telling the story today, that their cultures are kind of in the background and not what you think of as the dominant American culture. So their cultures are so diverse, we couldn't talk about one, right? It's not a uniform Native American culture. They're very, very diverse. There were probably 1,000 different languages in North America before the reduction in population after European contact.
What happens is that the United States is incredibly multicultural.
America is a melting pot. It's a crossroad of civilizations from different worlds.
The things that pull the entire United States together are going to be pretty high level things. They're going to be the deep history of becoming a nation and the more recent kind of big struggles that the nation has gone through together.
We certainly share national tragedies. And the vast majority of people were extremely disheartened and upset by the events of January 6th. We are extremely saddened if a national figure is killed or assassinated. If there's a national tragedy, 9/11 brought us together, made us understand that we were, in all our multiculturality, we shared this experience of being Americans.
There are going to be things like holidays that almost everybody celebrates. Thanksgiving is certainly a key part of American culture that is not celebrated in the same way in other parts of the world. Celebrating the 4th of July, celebrating Halloween in the particular way that we do is really different than the way those traditions are celebrated in most of the world. And they're going to be things, the sports tradition, sports like football, and I think basketball would be right up with football in many parts of the country. Give people with really different backgrounds something to share and something to talk about and something to kind of root for together.
Now, football we also associate it with, bare-chested fat men drinking a lot of beer and shouting vulgarities. But those are the things that you see in sporting events all over the world. That's not unique to the United States necessarily.
So it's one of those things that, yes, there is competition between people who cheer for different teams, but they understand the sport. And that is a unifying element. It's something that cross-cuts all of the things that divide us and gives people something in common that they can think about, talk about, invest some time and energy in. It is especially important, I think, in many American workplaces.
One day, my colleague here, I was watching Ohio State game, and he heard the noise and he came to, "You watch football?" Yes, I watch football because I've grown to know about the rules, and I have a team because I went to the Ohio State University. I'm rooting for the Buckeyes, and he was very glad to see someone different from him and coming from another country, and then showing that he appreciates the game.
We are a country of immigrants, some of whom came here freely and some of whom were forced and dragged. We have lived with people that we formerly enslaved. We live with people that their ancestors we formerly killed and took their land. But yet in the 21st century, we are all trying and striving to form a cohesive country. And in doing so, it is natural to learn from each other, to share each other's experiences and each other's practices.
There are different ideals about what it means to be an American, and the ideal of being inclusive, welcoming diversity is not something you would find everywhere in the world. We don't always live up to it, but it is kind of a core value, I think, in American culture. Even, going back to just the words that are on the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That sense that, right, we're going to welcome people who have had a hard time other places and invite them to come here. Like I said, we haven't always lived up to it. I'm thinking of all of the examples of nasty Americans brutally putting down Native communities and Black communities, and not treating immigrants from a lot of different places well when they first came. So it's not something that we've always put into action, but it is part of kind of what we want to live up to.
I'll just speak from my own personal experience. I just did my Ancestry.com, and they did the genetic DNA stuff. I'm about 50% German, 30% British, and then maybe another percent Viking. And so, yeah, I'm white, but I love African American music. I dedicated my life to first learning about it, and then writing about it, and then teaching about it. This is because I grew up in an urban society, Cincinnati, Ohio, listening to urban radio stations. And I've loved the music since I first heard it when I was 8. Yeah. And so our experiences were not separated from each other. We're more like concentric circles. And being concentric circles, we share, and in the sharing, you would like to think that we get to know each other and we get to respect each other.
I would point out that if you look at any country, anywhere in the world, ultimately, the people that live in that country will trace their origins back to immigrants who at some point arrived to that place.
Is France not a country of immigrants? The original people, when the Romans came to France, did the people that lived in France speak the same language as you? No, they didn't, because French is a Romance language. And where does France get its name from? France is named after a group of people called the Franks. The Franks were a Germanic tribe that invaded Rome, the Roman provinces of what is now France. So the original inhabitants, before the Romans came, they spoke Gaelic, like the Bretons. So if France has a unified culture based upon the old people, you should all be talking Gaelic. The French language is a language built out of a mixture of German and French. There's a bit of Gaelic in there, but not much. So really, someone from Ireland or Wales, those people, they are biologically the ones who were there before the Romans came, and they speak the same language that their ancestors spoke. French people, Welsh people, some Scots people, some people from Brittany, some people from Ireland, they could turn around to the French and say, the French don't have a culture. They're an immigrant people. Their language and their culture is just made up from cultures coming from other people. Not like us. We were here before the Franks invaded, before the Romans came, etc. So it's all about perspective. It's all about time. Okay, the United States has not existed as long as France has, as a nation state. But then again, how long has France existed as a nation, as an idea? How old is that idea? When historians look at the origins of national identity, there are generally two countries that they say it originated with. A strong sense of national identity. And just by coincidence, it's our countries. It's France and it's England. And it was very much the battle between those two countries that formed the identity. Basically, the French were always trying to control England and the English were always trying to control France. And that battle between the two made them develop strong sense of identity. Being English, the main characteristic of being English was not being in French. And the main characteristic of being French was not being English. And so that meant that those two countries had a strong sense of national identity before other European countries did. So when historians who look at the history of the nation state, they say the first two examples were England and France, because they developed this sense of identity long before other countries like Germany used common culture to form a state. Yeah. But most historians, when we're talking about a sense of national identity and a culture that's linked to that identity, they don't go any further back than about the time of the French Revolution. This idea of people belonging to a nation and the nation having a common culture, for most countries, Britain and France, England and France are the exceptions. It existed possibly earlier. But for most countries, that idea of a nation state with a common culture and identity is no older than about 200 years. And it was the French Revolution. And it was an idea exported mostly by the French, by Napoleon. France had got rid of the monarchy. The monarchy had previously been the focus for the nation's identity. And so it had to create some new focus. And it invented the idea of the nation. We are one people. And so that idea of the people being the state is by and large invented during the French Revolution. And then when France starts to conquer all the other European neighbors, some of those use that same idea to liberate themselves from the French. So this idea that a country has a culture and a common identity is only about 200 years old. And by that criteria, America is older than most countries. And it's probably got a stronger identity because America originated before the French Revolution.